biggest serial killer case in Tampa history. The public was very fearful during the time as the body count rose.
We have charged him with 9 counts of first-degree murder, plus other charges, sexual battery and rape.
A father stands in a darkened hallway, satisfaction spreading across his face. On the other side of the house, his wife lies bleeding on the bathroom floor. Their children huddle in their rooms, listening to screams they'll never forget. But this isn't the worst of what he'll become, not even close. Florida, 1984. Bodies are appearing across Tampa Bay at an alarming rate. Women with their throats slashed, others strangled with makeshift nooses. The pattern is unmistakable, methodical, terrifying. Police scramble as the body count rises. 5, 6, 7 victims. The public is gripped by fear. Who is hunting these women? And why can't anyone stop him? But here's what makes this case truly chilling. The killer wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in plain sight, coaching soccer, teaching his son to fish, playing the role of devoted father. His own children had no idea that the man who tucked them in at night was the monster the entire state was hunting. This is the story of Bobby Joe Long, a man who lived 2 lives so completely separate that even those closest to him never saw the darkness coming. And by the time they did, 9 women were dead, countless others traumatized, and 2 innocent children would spend the rest of their lives asking one impossible question: how do you love a monster? I'm about to take you inside one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. A case where the line between father and predator became so blurred that even now, decades later, those who survived him still can't fully comprehend what they lived through. Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the psychology behind true crime and want to understand how killers hide among us, make sure you're subscribed. Hit that notification bell, because the stories I cover will change how you see the world around you. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Back to a time when evil wore the most disarming mask imaginable: the face of a father. Picture this: South Florida, 1967, a sunny park where teenagers play football, and summer feels endless. 13-year-old Cindy Brown notices a new boy watching from the sidelines. He's 14, handsome, with a smile that makes her heart skip. His name is Bobby Joe Long, and in that moment, as their eyes meet for the first time, Cindy has no idea she's just encountered the person who will define and nearly destroy her entire life. Their love story started like something from a movie. Young, innocent, full of promise, Bobby was funny, charming, attentive in ways that made Cindy feel special. They'd go to the movies, snorkel in the Florida Keys, practice shooting together. To everyone watching, they were the perfect teenage couple, inseparable, devoted, destined for forever. But Bobby was carrying secrets, even then, secrets that were already shaping the man he would become. He'd recently moved to Florida with his mother after his parents separated. But this wasn't a clean break. It was a messy, traumatic split that left scars Bobby would carry for life. His mother worked as a barmaid, bringing home a rotating cast of men that young Bobby was forced to witness. Night after night, different strangers in his home, different voices, different faces, and with each one, something inside Bobby hardened. He began to resent her, to hate her even. But there was something else, something Bobby kept hidden even from Cindy, for as long as he could. He suffered from Klinefelter syndrome, a genetic condition that gave him an extra female chromosome. Because of it, he developed large, female-like breasts during puberty. For a teenage boy trying to fit in, trying to project strength and masculinity, this was devastating. He underwent surgery to remove them, but the scars remained, both physical and psychological. Even in the Florida heat, Bobby would swim with his shirt on. He'd make excuses, change the subject when anyone asked why, and when he and Cindy became intimate, he'd keep his shirt on even then. Unable to let her see the parts of himself he found shameful. This wasn't just about appearance. This was about control, about identity, about a young man who felt betrayed by his own body, increasingly unable to trust anything or anyone, including himself. In 1972, Bobby joined the military. 2 years later, at just 20 years old, he proposed to Cindy. Well, proposed might be generous. As Cindy remembers it, there was no romance, no grand gesture. Bobby simply looked at her one day and said, "We're always together. We might as well just get married." Not exactly poetry, but Cindy said yes anyway, because she loved him, because she believed in him, because she thought that together they could build the life neither of them had growing up. They married on January 25, 1974. Cindy was already pregnant, and for a brief moment, everything seemed possible. Bobby was trying to be a family man, trying to fit into the role society expected of him, trying to be normal. But then came the accident that changed everything. 3 months into their marriage, Bobby was riding his motorcycle to work, 65 miles per hour, a normal morning commute, and then impact. The details are hazy, but the result was catastrophic. Bobby was thrown from the bike, flying over 100 feet through the air, before landing directly on his head. When Cindy arrived at the hospital, Bobby was barely recognizable. Severe head trauma, brain injury. The doctors weren't sure what kind of cognitive or personality changes might result. All they could do was wait and see. Cindy was pregnant with their first child, suddenly thrust into the role of caretaker for a husband who was no longer quite the person she'd married. She quit her job to stay home and help him recover. Day after day, she watched him struggle with headaches, mood swings, confusion, and something else, something darker. Even in the hospital, Bobby wasn't himself. His personality had shifted in ways Cindy couldn't quite articulate. The warmth in his eyes had been replaced with something colder, harder. Where before he'd treated her with care and affection, now there was impatience, irritation, an edge of anger that hadn't been there before. After the accident, Bobby was medically discharged from the Army. The couple had their second child a year later, and that's when Cindy started to realize that the man she married was gone. In his place was someone she barely recognized. The compliments stopped. Bobby would tell Cindy she was fat, stupid, worthless, that no one else would want her. When she tried to defend herself, he'd grab her by the throat and pin her against the wall, his face inches from hers, warning her never to talk back. The violence escalated slowly, a pattern that experts in domestic abuse know all too well. Incremental increases that leave the victim confused about how they got here. First it was verbal abuse, then a shove, then a slap, then closed fists Until one day, Cindy realized she was living with a man who got satisfaction from hurting her. Bobby developed a particular method. He'd push Cindy down onto the bed, sit on her lower body, pin her arms with his knees so she couldn't protect her face. Then he'd pummel her, punching her in the head, choking her until she lost consciousness. And through it all, he'd stare directly into her eyes, watching her suffer. The children heard everything. Their bedroom was at the end of the hallway, close enough that every scream, every thud, every desperate gasp for air reached their ears. Christian, their young son, would lie in his bed listening to his mother being brutalized, knowing something terrible was happening, but unable to stop it. One night stands out in Christian's memory. He came out of his bedroom and saw his mother in the bathroom, crying, clearly hurt. Then he looked down the hallway and saw his father standing there, and the expression on Bobby's face made Christian's blood run cold. It wasn't remorse, it wasn't shame, it was satisfaction, pure, undisguised pleasure at what he'd done. For 6 years, Cindy endured this hell. 6 years of being told she was worthless, that she couldn't survive without him, that if she tried to leave, he'd find her. 6 years of broken promises that he'd change, that it would never happen again, that the man she fell in love with was still in there somewhere. She thought about leaving countless times, but Bobby had broken down her self-esteem so thoroughly that she believed him when he said she'd never make it on her own with 2 kids. Until June 1980, the night that almost killed her. Bobby knocked Cindy unconscious, slamming her into the corner of their floor model television. When she came to, she was lying on the couch, blood everywhere. Bobby looked at her with something almost like concern. Not for her well-being, but for the evidence. You need stitches, he told her, but if you tell them what happened, I promise you, I'll kill you. At the hospital, Cindy tried to lie. She told the doctor she'd tripped over a toy and hit the TV, but the doctor wasn't buying it. He returned with a police officer and a mirror. When Cindy saw her reflection, the perfect fingerprint-shaped bruises around her throat, she knew her lie was useless. The officer looked at her with a mixture of pity and determination. I'm coming back in a week, he told her. If you haven't filed for divorce or gotten him out of that house, I'm arresting him, because if I don't, he's going to kill you. That night, Cindy came home from the hospital, humiliated, terrified, desperate. She loaded a double-barreled shotgun and stood over Bobby as he slept. She held the gun to his head, finger on the trigger. Every part of her wanted to end it, to finally be free. But then she thought about her children, sleeping in the next room. What would happen to them if she pulled the trigger? Would they grow up knowing their mother killed their father? Would they hate her? Would they be taken away? The alarm clock went off at 5 a.m. Bobby opened his eyes and looked directly at her. He saw the gun, and he smiled. Go ahead, bitch, he said. You don't have the nerve. Cindy lowered the weapon. No, she said, I do have the nerve, but you're not worth losing my children over. She filed for divorce that week, and Bobby moved out. But the story doesn't end there, not even close. Here's what Cindy didn't know, what nobody knew. Bobby Joe Long had been living a double life for years. While playing the role of husband and father, he was simultaneously becoming one of Florida's most prolific serial rapists. It started in the late 1970s. Before the violence at home reached its peak, Bobby developed a method so simple so effective that he would later brag he could have continued indefinitely if he'd never escalated to murder. He called himself the Classified Ad Rapist. His technique was chillingly methodical. Bobby would scan the newspaper classified ads, looking for women selling furniture or household items. He'd call the number listed. If a woman answered, he'd engage her in friendly conversation, asking about the item, expressing interest, building rapport. Then he'd ask a seemingly innocent question. "Will anyone be home to help me load it into my truck?" If the answer was no, or if she mentioned her husband would be back later, Bobby knew he had found his victim. He'd show up at the scheduled time, dressed in a suit and tie, professional, friendly, completely non-threatening. He'd ask to see the item, to check if there was any mail around that could help with loading, and once he was inside, once he'd confirmed she was alone, he would strike. Bobby Joe long raped between 15 and 50 women using this method. The exact number may never be known. Many victims were too traumatized or ashamed to report the attacks. Others didn't realize the pattern, that they weren't random targets, but carefully selected victims of a predator who'd perfected his hunting technique. But what makes this even more disturbing is what was happening at home during this period. In 1976, just 2 years into his marriage to Cindy, one of Cindy's close friends and co-workers went to the police. She claimed Bobby had raped her. Bobby denied it vehemently. When police came to the house to question him, to search the premises, he maintained his innocence, until finally, under pressure, he changed his story. Okay, he admitted, they did have sex, but it was consensual. She was just angry about something and trying to get revenge. The police investigated and ultimately cleared him. They decided it was a case of regret, not rape. Consensual sex that the woman later tried to reframe as assault. Cindy wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, because to admit the alternative, that the man she'd married, the father of her children, was capable of rape, was too much to bear. But years later, after everything came to light, Cindy would look back on that moment with crushing clarity. "I know in my heart it wasn't consensual," she'd say. "I know in my heart he raped her." After the divorce in 1980, Bobby moved out. For young Christian, then about 6 years old, this marked the beginning of a strange, new chapter. His father was gone, but not gone, present but absent, a figure who would drift in and out of his life in ways that left him constantly off balance. Bobby moved around California, Mexico, working on cruise ships, living, as Christian would later describe it, the life of Riley, free from the constraints of family, free to pursue whatever dark urges drove him. Bobby seemed to be having the time of his life, but he still maintained contact with his children. He'd call regularly, visit when he was in Florida, take Christian and his sister for weekends or short trips, and during those visits, he was the father Christian remembers from his earliest years. Fun, attentive, loving, the man who taught him to rabbit hunt, who took him fishing, who felt like a storybook dad. How do you reconcile that? How does a child's brain process the fact that the man who patiently taught you to bait a hook, who laughed with you, who made you feel special and loved, is the same man who was brutalizing your mother, who was raping women across Florida, who was even then escalating toward murder? Christian couldn't reconcile it because he didn't know. None of them knew In 1983, Bobby moved back to Florida permanently, settling in Tampa, and that's when everything changed. Tampa in the 1980s had a reputation. It was a party town. Strip clubs, nightlife, a thriving red light district where prostitutes worked the streets, and tourists came for entertainment that skirted the edge of danger. For most people, it was just a city with a wild side. For Bobby Joe Long, it became a hunting ground. Something had shifted in Bobby. The rapes weren't enough anymore. The control, the domination, the terror he inflicted, none of it satisfied whatever darkness had taken root inside him. He needed more. He needed finality. He needed to erase his victims completely. He escalated to murder. Bobby's method evolved, but retained his signature elements of control. He'd cruise Tampa's red light district, looking for prostitutes, women who worked the streets, who'd get into cars with strangers, whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. He'd drive them to remote locations, rural roads where houses were sparse and screams would go unheard. What happened next revealed the true depths of his sadism. Bobby would rape his victims first, then he'd strangle them, often using makeshift ligatures, noose-like devices that gave him complete control over whether they lived or died. Some women had their throats slashed, others were shot. The method varied based on circumstances, but the brutality was consistent. And then he'd dump their bodies, not carefully hidden, not deeply buried, just discarded along rural roads like garbage, because to Bobby Joe Long, that's all they were, objects he'd used and thrown away. The first body appeared in March 1984, then another, and another. By summer, Tampa was gripped by fear, unlike anything the city had experienced. Women were terrified to go out at night. Prostitutes stopped working certain areas. The media was in a frenzy. Police were under enormous pressure to catch the killer before he struck again. But Bobby was methodical, organized. He left few clues at the crime scenes beyond red fibers that forensics would later trace to his car's interior. He used different methods to kill, making it harder to establish definitive patterns. And crucially, he seemed to understand what investigators were looking for and how to avoid giving it to them. The body count rose. 5 victims, 6, 7. The public was terrified, and through it all, Bobby maintained his other life. He'd still call his ex-wife Cindy. He'd still make arrangements to see his children. And one morning, during one of their regular phone conversations, Cindy mentioned something she'd seen on the news. Another body had been found in Tampa, the 4th or 5th victim of what police were now calling a serial killer. "Bob, what the hell is going on in Tampa?" Cindy asked. Bobby's response chills the blood. "That's what I tell you girls," he said casually. "When you go out to the clubs on weekends, you can never be too careful. You just never know who's out there." The audacity, the sociopathy. To warn his ex-wife about the danger of going out alone, when he was the danger, when he was the reason women across Tampa were terrified, when he was the monster mothers warned their daughters about. But that's the nature of psychopathy, the ability to compartmentalize so completely that you can discuss your own crimes as though they're someone else's tragedy, to warn people about yourself without a flicker of conscience. By late 1984, Bobby Joe Long had killed at least 9 women, raped dozens more, terrorized an entire city. And yet, to his children, he was still just dad. Christian would visit him in Tampa. They'd hang out, catch up, spend time together. Bobby would ask about school, about Christian's life, about what he was interested in. He'd be warm, attentive, present, everything a father should be. How is this possible? How does a human being exist in two completely opposite states simultaneously? Psychologists call it compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of identity so completely that they don't interact or conflict. For Bobby Joe Long, the father and the killer were two entirely separate personas, occupying the same body. When he was with his children, he was fully immersed in that role. When he was hunting, he was someone else entirely. But there's something else at play here. Something even darker. The satisfaction of deception. Bobby wasn't just maintaining two lives. He was getting away with it. Every conversation with Cindy, where he warned her about the Tampa killer. Every weekend with his kids, where they had no idea what he'd done days before. Every moment of normalcy was proof of his superiority, his cunning, his ability to fool everyone. That's part of the thrill for killers like Bobby Joe Long. It's not just about the murders. It's about the power of living a lie so complete that even those closest to you never suspect. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming, because Bobby Joe Long's reign of terror didn't end because of brilliant detective work or forensic breakthroughs. It ended because of one 17-year-old girl who refused to become another statistic. November 3rd, 1984, Lisa McVeigh was riding her bike home from her late-night shift at Krispy Kreme Donuts. She was exhausted, pedaling through the dark streets of Tampa, just wanting to get home and sleep. She had no idea she was about to be abducted by Florida's most wanted serial killer. Bobby pulled up beside her. Before she could react, he forced her off her bike and into his car. Lisa was terrified. She'd heard the news reports, knew about the bodies being found, knew exactly what this might mean. But Lisa McVeigh wasn't like Bobby's other victims. She'd survived abuse her entire life. She'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. And instead of panicking, instead of fighting in ways that would have gotten her killed, Lisa did something extraordinary. She started manipulating her captor. Bobby drove Lisa back to his apartment, where he held her for 26 hours. He raped her repeatedly, but through it all, Lisa kept her composure. She complied with his demands, but she also talked to him. She told him about her sick grandfather who needed her care. She made herself human in his eyes, not just another object to be used and discarded. And here's the stunning part. It worked. Bobby started to trust her, to care about her. In his twisted way, he told her he wished he could keep her. And then, incredibly, he let her go. But Lisa wasn't just surviving. She was observing. While blindfolded, she managed to peek out and memorize details about Bobby's apartment. She noticed street signs, landmarks, a Quality Inn and Howard Johnson nearby. She even saw him stop at an ATM to withdraw cash, noting the location. When Bobby finally released her, Lisa went straight to the police. And unlike most victims of sexual assault, she had details, specific, actionable intelligence about her attacker's location, his apartment layout, his car, his patterns. Within 30 hours, the Tampa Bay serial killer case broke wide open. November 16, 1984, Bobby Joe Long was arrested at his apartment. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Lisa's testimony, fibers matching those found on multiple victims, items taken from his apartment that linked him to the murders. When detectives interviewed him, Bobby didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to finally talk about what he'd done. The interrogation tapes are disturbing to hear. Bobby describes his methods with clinical detachment, explaining how he selected victims, how he killed them, why he did what he did. There's no remorse in his voice, no horror at his own actions, just a matter-of-fact recounting of violence, as though discussing grocery shopping. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster was caught, the terror was over. But for one family, the real nightmare was just beginning. Cindy was at home with the kids when the phone rang. It was Bobby. "You know those girls in Tampa we were talking about?" he said, his voice strange, hollow. "I killed them." Cindy's world imploded. She kept asking him why, how he could hurt strangers when he'd always claimed he never meant to hurt her. Bobby just kept repeating the same thing. "Please tell the kids I was killed in a car accident, please." Cindy refused. "There's no way I'm lying to my children about this." Hours later, another call came, this time from Sergeant Latimer with the Hillsborough Police Department. Bobby had been arrested and charged with 8 murders. 8. The number would eventually rise to 9. Cindy was hysterical. "How do you tell your children something like this? How do you explain that the man who taught them to fish, who took them to the park, who they loved with all their hearts, is a serial killer?" Christian was 10 years old, lying on the living room floor watching TV with his sister, when he heard his mother's voice change. That tone of absolute terror. He turned and saw her face, pure shock, disbelief, horror. Within days, Christian and his sister learned the truth. Their father had been arrested. He'd killed women, multiple women. The storybook father they'd known was also a monster. "It made me feel very confused," Christian would later say. "It opened the door to a lot of questions that no kid really should have to ask themselves. Is this something that's going to happen to me because this is my dad? Am I going to do the same things?" Christian was 10 years old, suddenly wondering if evil was genetic, if the darkness inside his father was also inside him, waiting to surface. Bobby Joe Long's trial for the murder of Virginia Johnson began on April 22, 1985. The jury deliberated for just 40 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. 40 minutes. That's how clear-cut the evidence was. In May 1985, Bobby was sentenced to death. He would later plead guilty to 8 additional murders in exchange for a plea deal. For nearly 35 years, Bobby Joe Long sat on death row at Florida State Prison, filing appeals, fighting his sentence, trying everything possible to avoid execution. And through those 35 years, his son Christian struggled with an impossible reality. Christian visited his father in prison, not often, but regularly enough to maintain some kind of relationship. The visits were surreal. Sitting across from your father in a maximum security prison, trying to have normal conversations while knowing what he'd done, knowing that the man you're talking to, the man you still loved despite everything, is a monster responsible for unimaginable suffering. You can be angry with somebody and still love them. Christian explains, but it's hard to watch them take him back. Every time, you really kind of relive the loss of your loved one. Every time you go up there, because you get them back for a few minutes. And then suddenly, they tell you it's time to go, and he has to go back to his box. Christian never asked his father why. He wanted to, desperately wanted to understand what could drive someone to do what Bobby did, but he could never find the words. And Bobby never volunteered an explanation. For Cindy, the years after Bobby's arrest were about rebuilding, about trying to give her children as normal a life as possible. Despite carrying the name of one of Florida's most notorious serial killers, they faced bullying at school, friends who were suddenly no longer allowed to see them, whispers and stares wherever they went. We became second-class citizens. Christian remembers January 2019. Ron DeSantis became governor of Florida. 4 months later, he signed Bobby Joe Long's death warrant. The execution was scheduled for May 23, 2019, at 6 p.m. For Christian, the time between the warrant being signed and the actual execution felt like a blur, a rush of conflicting emotions, grief, anger, relief, sadness, all tangled together in a knot he couldn't untangle. Cindy visited Bobby one last time the week before his execution. It was the first time she'd seen him in 18 years. The whole drive to the prison, she prayed for the right words. What do you say to the man who destroyed your life, who you once loved, who's about to die? They talked for hours, and for the first time in all the years Cindy had known him, Bobby Joe Long apologized, not the empty, manipulative apologies he'd given during their marriage. A real apology, sincere, filled with genuine remorse for what he'd done to her. I told him, I forgive you for what you did to me, Cindy said, but I don't think I'll go to my grave forgiving you for what you've done to all those girls, to my children, to how you cheated my grandchildren. Bobby tried to change the subject, old habits, even at the end, but Cindy wouldn't let him. No, she said, you're not controlling me anymore. Christian spoke to his father several times in the final week. Bobby told him not to come to the execution. He didn't want his son to have that memory, to carry that image for the rest of his life. So Christian stayed home. He spent the day fishing with his kids, exactly as his father had requested. At 6 p.m. on May 23, 2019, Bobby Joe Long was executed by lethal injection. A reporter who witnessed the execution described it as watching an old man fall asleep, calm, peaceful. The warden asked if Bobby had any final words for the victims or their families. Bobby's face was rough, tired. He simply said no, and then he was gone. Christian describes losing his father 3 times. First when his parents divorced, then when Bobby was arrested and imprisoned, finally when he was executed. 3 separate deaths, each one stripping away another piece of the father he'd loved. It's hard to deal with, Christian says, because I feel like I've lost my father 3 times. The tragedy of Christian's story is that he's a victim too, not in the same way as the women his father murdered or raped, but a victim nonetheless. He lost his past. The innocent memories of fishing trips and park visits are now forever tainted by the knowledge of who his father really was, and he lost his future, any chance of reconciliation, of understanding, of answers. For Cindy, her final visit with Bobby brought a measure of closure. The nightmares that had plagued her for decades, dreams of Bobby chasing her, trying to hurt her or the children, stopped completely after his execution. For the first time in 40 years, she could sleep peacefully. But one question lingers, one question that Christian Cindy and everyone who knew Bobby Joe Long still can't answer. How does someone become this? Was it the motorcycle accident that damaged his brain? Was it his troubled relationship with his mother? Was it the Klinefelter syndrome and the shame he carried about his body? Was it something genetic, something fundamental in his wiring that was always broken? Or was it all of these things? A perfect storm of trauma, biology, and psychology that created a monster? We'll never know, because Bobby Joe Long took that answer to his grave. What we do know is this: evil doesn't always look like we expect. It doesn't always hide in the shadows or wear an obvious mask. Sometimes evil goes fishing with its kids. Sometimes it tucks you in at night and tells you bedtime stories. Sometimes evil is so good at pretending to be normal that even those who live with it every day never see it coming. And that might be the most terrifying truth of all. Bobby Joe Long destroyed countless lives. 9 women dead, dozens raped, a community terrorized, a family shattered. But somehow, through all of that destruction, Christian and Cindy survived. They built new lives. They found ways to heal, even if the scars will never fully fade. Christian now has 7 children of his own. He's been married for 17 years. He's built the kind of stable, loving family he never had growing up. And every day, he makes a conscious choice to be nothing like his father. I just want to see things keep getting better, he says. And they do, a little bit, every day. As for the question that haunts him, whether the darkness inside his father might also be inside him, Christian has found his answer in his actions, in the father he's chosen to be, in the life he's chosen to build. Because Bobby Joe Long may have been his father, but Bobby Joe Long doesn't get to define who Christian is. That's the final victory. The monster doesn't win, the cycle breaks, and somehow, impossibly, love and healing survive even the darkest evil. If this story affected you the way it affected me, if you're still thinking about Christian's impossible choice between loving a father and condemning a monster, then you need to see the video on your screen right now. I believe it was made specifically for you. It's a story that will change how you see the world. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.